The real is the mystery of the speaking body. It is the mystery of the unconscious. What is the mystery of the unconscious? Let's just start there. And how exactly is it related to the speaking body? The fundamental mystery of the unconscious is its dimensionality, spelled with a D-I-T at the front, as you damn well know. It's the fact that, as Lacan puts it, we can deal with the unconscious only on the basis of what is said by the analysand. This is how Lacan puts it on page 192 in the French. It's a great passage. It's a great bearing in the midst of all of this. It also raises some questions. How is it possible that strictly and solely by way of what can be said of unconscious truth, even if only as nonsense, we're somehow able to account for what cannot be said of it, and thus remains ever absent? This, it seems to me, is the basic mystery of the unconscious. It is every bit a methodological mystery. And it's largely because of this mystery, I think, that the speaking body remains a mystery as well. Let me explain. When Lacan repeatedly says, the act and fact of speaking is forgotten behind what is said, we just can't exclude the unconscious from this said. Conscious knowledge is not the same as unconscious knowledge, as you know, but they are both effect structures of the said. Known, knowable, and even unknowable fields of knowledge are all outgrowths or extensions of the same dimension, namely that of language. All too often, the speaking body is forgotten behind these epistemologies. And if you think technically about it, that's really what we have here, a mashup of language or discourse and knowledge. We have epistemologies, conscious and unconscious alike. And the speaking body is forgotten behind both. This is Lacan's central argument. I think this localization of the speaking body, of the saying, behind matters a lot. The localization here matters. Relative to the existence of these language knowledge formations that we call conscious and unconscious knowledge, the speaking body can only exist, insisting there, but ever from without, beyond, outside, elsewhere, indeed nowhere. This is what Lacan means by forgotten behind. You see, it's not just a behind, it's a forgotten behind, suggestive of oblivion. In this sense, its existence marks what Lacan calls a break in knowledge. Now, the French doesn't exactly say break in knowledge. This is the translation that Bruce gives us for this particular riff of Lacan's. And it does work, functionally speaking. It does work, and it kind of makes sense when you look at the word rupture in French. Notice, once more though, what we're doing with existence here as break in knowledge. Again, following the lead of our beloved translator of this text. The speaking body, as an instantiation of the evental act of saying, persists and makes its claims felt with a certain insistence. Insistence within the fields of conscious and unconscious knowledge alike, but ever from somewhere else, somewhere other than these epistemic dimensions, an other place that marks a break, split, or fissure in each. I'll say it again because that's a pretty important riff, I think, to have in mind as we're moving through the final chapters of Seminar 20. The speaking body, as an instantiation of the evental act of saying, it persists and makes its claims felt with a certain insistence within the fields of conscious and unconscious knowledge alike. That's what I mean when I say it exists. It persists and makes its claims felt with a certain insistence within those fields, but ever from somewhere else, from without. It's an insistence from the outside, from beyond these epistemic dimensions. A beyond, though, that is on the inside of each. And that's the tricky part about all this, because we're talking about a break, split, or fissure in knowledge. Again, straight from Bruce's translation and straight from some of Bruce's commentary on these materials. Okay, let's get back to our book, though. On page 119, it's at the start of chapter 10. I think Lacan gives us a word for this other place that marks a break, split, or fissure in conscious and unconscious knowledge alike. We'll come to that word in a second. It's a word which further allows us, I think, to capture the extimate status of the speaking body as a break in knowledge. So when I say existence, you should hear also extimacy. I'm messing around with that other Lacanian term that allows for a mingling of insides and outsides. It's the extimate status of the speaking body as a break in knowledge. And again, note, we're not talking about a break from knowledge. We're talking about a break in knowledge. Again, rupture is the word Lacan uses here in the French, suggesting a breakup, a split up, an interruption, a caesura if you're feeling extra fancy today. Hence, again, why I'm using existence, but also extimacy here. Extimate alongside that insistence from without. The speaking body, simply put, is an external intimacy, or if you prefer, an intimate exterior, as inside and outside, conscious and unconscious knowledge, as the surfaces of a torus, and really there is only one, or that of a Mobius strip, and again, we only have one. Which brings us to that word I mentioned, the word that Lacan uses to help us make sense of all of this. As a break in conscious and unconscious knowledge, which is not itself reducible to either field, the existence of the speaking body is inter D, as Lacan puts it. I-N-T-E-R, the Latin between, plus the French D-I-T, meaning said. It's on page 119. You can check it out. In French, as you may know, inter-D means prohibited, forbidden, censored, and the like. But not if you write it with a hyphen between the inter and the D, Lacan says. The extimate elsewhere to which knowledge banishes the speaking body, and from which it always reemerges, is betwixt and between the seds that comprise conscious knowledge, as well as the seds that comprise unconscious knowledge. Hence, inter D, with a hyphen, which allows us to ask and answer a key question here at the end of Seminar 20. What is this interdimension that houses speaking bodies? That's the question right now. What is this interdimension that houses speaking bodies as a break in dimensionality? Well, I'll tell you one thing, it ain't a dimension. But instead, if we were going to toy with Lacan's French here, as I'm inclined to do at this point in our reading, a dire mention, dire being his word for the saying. We're talking about a saying site. The break in knowledge is a saying site. So, you like your Heidegger? We got some Heidegger for you. Here we go. If language is the house of being, what I'm suggesting here at the end of Seminar 20 is Lacan is showing us that the interstices of language are that of speaking, not being, of saying, of the dire. If language is the house of being, the gaps of which language is made, these are the homes of speaking instead. And if the saids of the analysand point us toward what's known, knowable, and unknowable to them, from conscious meaning to unconscious truth, what we can say is that their sayings from within these interstitial spaces send us even further afield, redirecting us beyond truth and toward the real. Clinically and conceptually speaking, if you ask me, everything turns on this redirection, and Lacan seems to know it. Here's how he puts it. We have to expose the kind of real to which this inter-D grants us access. He says it on page 119, leaving little doubt, in my mind at least, about the stakes involved in the extimate break in knowledge occupied by the speaking body. If you ask me another question about the speaking body, let's just kind of play this out as though we're engaged in some kind of fucking dialogue here. I'll tell you, I don't think the mystery of the speaking body is how it wound up there. I don't think that's the question that we should be asking. Not how did it get there into this interstitial space between the saids of knowledge of every type, except corporal, of course. The question about the speaking body, its fundamental mystery in all of this, is not how it wound up there in the unsaid and unknown gaps of which Lang and Lalong alike are comprised. Nah, man. The mystery of the speaking body is how it emerges from these gaps, not how it found its way to them, but how it emerges from them. In the act and fact of saying, how does the speaking body emerge from these gaps in acts and facts of saying? And how do these embodied, evental, and enjoyed sayings allow us to access the real, or at least hold a place for it, especially in analytic experience? Unconscious knowledge, as you know, is premised on the saids of la language and conditions two types of enjoyment, one possible and the other impossible. Possible enjoyment derives from the parts of unconscious truth that can be said and known. Impossible enjoyment derives from the parts of unconscious truth that cannot be said or known. Impossible enjoyment that cannot be and cannot fail, and that's exactly what it is. Impossible enjoyment is enjoyment that cannot be and cannot fail. Cannot fail to remain just that, something which cannot be. This is the lesson we've got from Seminar 20 regarding impossible enjoyment. It is enjoyment that cannot be and cannot fail to remain just that, non-existent. But possible enjoyment, this is the slippery one here. Possible enjoyment, which derives from the parts of unconscious truth that can be said and known, this is enjoyment that can be. And by passing from the field of potentiality to that of actuality, can and does also change in the process. No longer possible, enjoyment now becomes contingent. This is how we are arriving at contingent enjoyment. This is how we're arriving at that corporal contingency. It's when possible enjoyment, as derived from the parts of unconscious truth that can be said and known, do indeed pass into fields of the said and the known in the realm of conscious knowledge. Possible enjoyment is enjoyment that can be, and in so becoming, if you will, shifts its modality from potentiality to actuality, and by extension, the possibility that you see in the part of unconscious truth that can be said and can be known is shed. The emergence from this field of potentiality is of a contingent corporal event. This is precisely how the speaking body emerges from the interdimensions of conscious and unconscious knowledge alike as a corporal contingency. What becomes of this corporal contingency? What happens once the body emerges in an act of speaking as a corporal contingency? Well, at the end of Seminar 20, I think Lacan suggests two destinies for this corporal contingency. One is imaginary and fueled by desirous subjectivity. The other, thank goodness, is not imaginary but real and fueled by the embodied acts of speaking whose mysteries we are unraveling. Let's start with the first. The imaginary response to a corporal contingency like the speaking body is to reduce this body of the other, their jouissance as well, to a body alone, and often imparts, each of which function as an object cause of desire for a certain subject. So the imaginary response that is fueled by desirous subjectivity is fundamentally a reductive response. It reduces the speaking body of the other, by which we mean the other sex, by which we mean the feminine, and their jouissance as well, to a body alone. A body alone that is ever a body in parts, always loved to pieces, when you recall that hate is indeed the telos of narcissistic love. And these are parts or pieces that function as little a's. They function as object causes of desire for this subject who reduces. No longer the signal of an impossible sexual relationship, the speaking body becomes a little more than a reified bodily prop for an imaginary asexual relationship. And Lacan is messing with this asexual stuff. I think we should check it out, because the A here in this asexual rapport, if you like, matters. It is indeed objet A. The key passage is page 127. I can't resist calling your attention to it. What's happening here is the other, in all of its multiplicity and complexity, is being reduced to objet A, little more than a cause of someone else's desire, an object for their subject's consumption. Check it out. Objet A, Lacan tells us on page 127, can be said to be, as its name indicates, asexual. The other presents itself to the subject only in an asexual form. Everything that has been the prop, substitute prop, or substitute for the other in the form of the object of desire is asexual. Let's cut to the chase here. Time is short. This desirous, quintessentially phallic circuit of subjects with their little objects, consumers with their widgets, wobbles, and commodities, these beings in search of wholeness with partial love objects they think will get them there. All of this shit is quintessentially masculine, ever on display in the discourse of the master, and culminates in what Lacan on page 121 brilliantly calls a passion for ignorance. The desirous subject, call it masculine, call it master, hell, call it daddy, he sure wishes you would. Call it whatever the fuck you want. The desirous subject wants to know nothing about the speaking and thus enjoying body of the other it reduces to objet a, in a fantasy that can only be defined as fundamental because it amounts to a deaf and dumb wager on the one. This is the passion for ignorance. Notice, we're not talking about the fact of the other, but a fantasy of the one. That's what the passion for ignorance will get you. Where love could have flourished in the complex best of Lacanian ways, we are left with its most tragic telos instead. A tragic telos of love, which is the very final word of Seminar 20. Hate. The hate implicit in every reduction of body to being, other to objet a, partners to parts, complex multiplicities to consumable ones. This is what the passion for ignorance will get you. Not surprisingly, the jouissance sustained by this passion for ignorance is woefully insufficient and equally inadequate, but also perverse, crazy, and enigmatic as hell. So much the worse for that sexual rapport, which this fallible mode of enjoyment nevertheless continues to promise. And because I want you to know that I'm not making this shit up, flip your books to page 144. There's no such thing as a sexual relationship, Lacan says, because one's jouissance of the other taken as a body is always inadequate, perverse on the one hand, insofar as the other is reduced to objet a, and crazy and enigmatic on the other, I would say. Thankfully, this is not our only option. This is not our only way forward when corporal contingency pops up. So let me ask you, what happens when we do not reduce the speaking body of the other in all its corporal contingency to object little a, and thus little more than a fantastical prop of our own masculine, would-be masterful, blind as hell desire? Well, I'll tell you, when you don't reduce the speaking body of the other in all its corporal contingency to objet a, You don't get an imaginary asexual relationship. That's for sure. But note, nor do you gain access to the sexual rapport. A sexual rapport that is no such thing and thus real. So when you don't reduce the other to the cause or object cause of your own desire, congratulations, you've managed to avoid an imaginary asexual relationship. But don't think that this somehow allows you to access a sexual relationship that is no such thing and thus not imaginary but real. Don't fool yourself. What you get instead, it seems to me, is an act of speaking encore, in body, whose saying shows that phallic enjoyment is not the only way to be with others, but also that even when we enjoy beyond the phallic function, we remain exiled from the sexual relationship. Even for the speaking body, yours and mine alike, there is no such thing as a sexual relationship, which is all our bodies ever say to each other if you think about it. This is not it. Or, to give you a sense of where I'm headed, what I say is what there isn't. You know what? As I think about it here, I can only call to mind two substantial passages on contingency in Seminar 20. It's a central term that is fundamentally treated only twice. I'm not saying it doesn't pop up here and there, but it's only substantially dealt with twice in this key text in Lacanian Psychoanalysis. The first dealing emerges from Lacan's riff on corporal contingency in Chapter 8, which we've discussed. The second dealing, and the one that concerns us here, it arrives in the final paragraphs of the final chapter in Seminar 20, right at the end of things. And it's here, at last, that the mystery of the speaking body, ever exiled from the real to which it nevertheless appeals, allows itself to begin to be solved. The sexual relationship doesn't stop not being written. You've heard me say in this squirrely utterance that Lacan surely delights in trotting out himself. But note, this doesn't mean that the sexual relationship lends itself to speaking instead. Just because it doesn't stop not writing itself, that doesn't mean that you can speak that shit into existence. Notice, nothing can speak it. Lacan plainly states on page 144, there is no existence of the sexual relationship in the act of speaking. This is the point that I'm also trying to make here at the end of things for you. Just because you've avoided slipping into an imaginary asexual relationship governed by the phallic function alone, it doesn't mean that you somehow now have access to a sexual relationship that is no such thing and thus real. Now, you've also heard me, among many echoes, recite Lacan's definition of contingency, also in a squirrely, writerly way. And it goes like this. You've heard me echo Lacan's definition of contingency as that which does stop not being written. The sexual relationship doesn't stop not being written, and as such it is impossible. But when contingency pops, something stops not being written. What stops not being written when the speaking body emerges from the interdimensions of consciousness and unconscious alike, is evidence of the fact that we cannot write the sexual relationship into existence, no matter how hard we try, with text and tongue alike. In the corporal contingency of the speaking body, we encounter this fundamental fact of lived linguistified experience. And I'll say it again, we are forever exiled from the sexual relationship. On this point, Lacan is explicit. Flip the page and join me on 145. Ooh, we're getting close to the end of things. 145, the book ends on 146. Oh boy, we're getting close here. Check it out. I incarnated contingency in the expression stops not being written. So here, Lacan, in this second substantial dealing with the modality of the contingent, is referring back to his first. And he's reminding us that in that first dealing with contingency, he incarnated it in this expression that goes, it's that which stops not being written. For here, he continues, there is nothing but encounter. The encounter in the partner of symptoms and affects, of everything that marks in each of us the trace of his exile, not as subject, but as speaking, his exile from the sexual relationship. Let this destiny of the speaking body, which is nothing less than an encounter with destiny itself, bring us to the end of Lesson 1 and the beginning of Lesson 2.